Hello, friends and Artist Forge family. Welcome back to another morning walk with the Artist Forge. My name is Nicole York. I will be your host, and today with me are your wonderful and talented and all of the other great adjectives I can use co-hosts Becca Bjorky, Matt Stagliano, Bassam Sabah, and Kat Ford Coates. So glad to be with you guys this morning. How are y'all?
Great. I installed a toilet yesterday.
Woohoo!
I don't know. It's little victories. Now, nothing's hooked up. It's not usable, but it sits there nice and pretty and it's bolted to the floor. It's about as far as we've gotten. That's
Is that why your back hurts?
What's that?
Is that why your back hurts? You actually did some work finally?
No, my back hurts from carrying the weight of the world on my shoulders, Bassam.
I see.
But yeah.
I felt like there was going to be like a Yo Mama joke in there somewhere, and it
somewhere.
And it wasn't. How about everybody else? How was your weekend?
We had a big pool party on Saturday.
That's right.
35 people had an amazing time. It went so smoothly. It was all good, and everyone had a good time. So very happy.
That sounds outstanding. How about you, Becca?
Pretty good. I kind of spent the week prepping for my exciting event this week, which is on Wednesday and Thursday. I'm going to be streaming with Adobe Live, which is pretty cool. And so if you guys want to watch me make places that don't exist and monsters.
Where do they find it, Becca?
It's going to be on Behance and on YouTube. I don't know where else they stream, but yeah.
Heck yeah. How about you, Bassam? Or sorry, I asked Bassam. How about you, Kat?
I'm good. I worked all day Saturday, and then I came home yesterday. I am not meant for public consumption visually this morning, so you get my avatar. But yeah, I'm here, and yeah, I'm ready to start this week.
I'm fine. It's ready to go. It's good.
It's a Monday.
It is. It is one of those days. If you are with us today, hanging out in the audience, we would love to hear from you. Let us know how you're doing. I see Justin is with us this morning. Glad to have you with us, Justin. If you're hanging out today, let us know. We want to hear from you. And let me make some adjustments over here real quickly because we have got all kinds of good things to take a look at this morning to show more examples of visual literacy, which is, of course, what we've been talking about for the last few weeks. And we are going to get some examples of color. So let me go ahead and do the actual morning introduction right after I just one more time invite you guys. If you're hanging out with us this morning, say hi in the comments. We want to know who's here so we can say hi to you. All right. So welcome everybody to yet another morning edition of Morning Walk with the Artist Forge, where we learn to think like artists. And of course, as we've been talking about visual literacy, we have covered a whole lot of topics from the context of the image on through to the internal language of the image in things like influences and themes. And today we are talking about color and how color influences how we interpret the images that we see. So, of course, color has huge psychological and cultural impact. And that is a big way that we take and interpret the images. And we're going to see that not only in examples of things like color palettes and images that are basically the same shot with different colors so that we can see how that affects the way that we read it. But also we're going to look at a few pieces of art and see if we can figure out how is color coming into play here and what do we interpret from the colors that the artist has decided to include in the image. So also saying good morning to Crystal. So glad to have you with us here this morning, Crystal. If anybody else is here, don't be afraid to say hi. And remember, the whole point of doing this live is so we can get your questions and your thoughts and your insight into the kinds of things that we're going to be looking at this morning. So before we jump into that, I want to begin by asking everybody a question. So, of course, if you are in the photography realm, you probably know the queen of color, Kate Woodman. She is just a mastermind where color is concerned. And that is one of the most noticeable and focal parts of her work. But other artists have decided they want to move color out of the equation and focus purely on things like light and form. So I want to ask everybody, the artists that are here today, how do you approach color personally? Is it one of those things that is a big focus of your work, or do you find that you kind of try to set it off to the side and focus more on other things?
Admittedly, I'm color ignorant, meaning color theory is just not something I've ever concentrated on. I understand its importance, and I've been trying to learn. There's actually a guy on, I want to say it's TikTok or Instagram. He's called The Color Nerd, and he does everything with pigment. And I'm talking like the art and science of color. And it fascinates me as to all the different pigments and shades and tones and like all the names for all this stuff. I can't even pronounce phthalo blue. And here he is, talking about the 10 variations of it. From the standpoint of color, I don't use it in my work as its own subject or its own thing like Kate does, which is fascinating to me. I shoot a lot in black and white because I'm more concerned about light itself and, the expression and the whole image, and I like the drama of it. I'd love to be able to incorporate color more thoughtfully. I just don't. Anything you see with color with mine, you're like, wow, that looks great. It's one of two things: pure, unabashed luck that it came out looking good, or I've just splattered so much infinite color panel on it that it has no choice but to look good. But that's about where I come from.
Shout out to ICP and the Infinite Color Universe. I think a lot of people will also probably identify with that, Matt, because as we talked about before, visual literacy encompasses everything that we see. And so it can be really overwhelming. And a lot of folks might feel like when we talk about all these things, what we're saying is you have to use and pay attention to every facet of this all the time, which is not true. You get to decide what levers you work with in your work, right? And if color is just not one of those ones that you focus on, that's a legitimate creative choice. Like there's, I'm not going to go say that Peter Lindbergh's photography would have been better if he would have shot more color, right? No, I want black and white, moody portraits. Like that's what I want from him. I love that. It's powerful. So hopefully for people who are listening and kind of see themselves reflected in that, like, yeah, I don't think about color that much. Hopefully this will kind of both be a little bit illuminating, but also let people know, just like with everything else, that if this is an area like of your technique that you choose not to focus on, it's not going to kill you either. You still can make legitimate creative choices without color being a focal point. Justin saying he loves color, and since I light blade, it's a big part of the image, and that makes a lot of sense. We have more friends in the Facebook community showing up. Good morning.
That's Dustin.
Dustin, what's up, my pal? We got to get you on here one of these mornings, dude. I'm gonna hit you up and we're gonna drag you in with us. And then Crystal saying, I love the play on color, but it usually isn't a major component of my client work. I do focus on it with my personal work, which is super interesting. And it makes sense when you're bringing in a client who may have, their own preferences for color. And then you have to be able to work with your natural taste and their taste as well. So it makes sense to maybe not make that a focus if that's not where your passion is at. Totally can understand that. So Becca, Kat, Bassam, do any of you guys have specific thoughts for your own work when it comes to color?
Yeah. Not really far off from what Matt does in terms of color. I think we do kind of similar type of photography. Where I find color comes in for me is with my clients is really, they come in. Yes, we talk about outfits before. Sometimes we're more prepared than other times, but I find where I use color is really trying to make some sense from what they brought with them as outfits and what they're looking for, right? With the various options I have in the studio, whether it's the backgrounds, whether it's paper rolls, whether it's just white background, whatever it is. So I find I'm trying to get a good starting point so that I have something to work with from a color perspective based on what they brought as outfits, because that's most of the work I do is client work. And then obviously I go tweak it in Infinite Color Panel and whatever other panel you can imagine. There's a whole bunch of them on my computer, as you guys know, from Pratik. So that's where I start tweaking and making sure that I go back to some of the color theory that I learned. I did buy Kate's course on color. It was amazing, and I try to apply some of the things I learned there. More and more I find now. Now, when I do personal work, I pay a little more attention, but often it is more in post-production than it is. Yes, I get a good base, but I experiment and fool around a lot in post-production.
Makes sense. Yeah, I think probably a lot of folks are going to identify with you guys. I noticed Becca, when I asked the question, she was like this. There's something on that woman's mind.
I mean, the thing that's really on my mind, though, is just I think about color all the time, and I can't not think about color just from a narrative perspective. And I also don't think that you're able to talk about color without talking about light. And I think differentiating them is not the best approach. It's not, really an authentic approach, because color is reliant on light. And even a monochromatic or black and white imagery, there's still this implication of color. If you're shooting, on actual film, it impacts the way that your final black and white image is going to come out, depending on the colors of the scene, the colors of the light. And then, of course, in digital imaging, the way that we translate that color information into black and white is also impacted by the original color. So even if you have just a simple, moody, classic black and white portrait of someone, beautiful woman with a dark lip, there's going to be probably that implication of red, that implication of, if it's sultry or not, depending on the image. But I do love black and white. I do, but I'd say most of my work is usually in color because of the narrative weight that color holds, and how much you learn about your environment, about your character, because of the situational lighting, the situational color, and all of those have to be informed decisions to drive the story. So I am team color all the way.
Yeah. I'm really excited to get into that in a little bit. And we actually have some examples of light and color changes so that we can see how those things are tied together, and just make sure that we understand that those are, it is the same thing. I mean, pigment is one thing, but you can't see pigment without light. So those things obviously have to have that really important interplay. And I love that you mentioned the narrative weight of it, because we're going to look at some examples of that. And I'll share my thoughts in a little bit on my own work, but I'm dying to hear, Kat, from your perspective also. So Matt, Kat, Bassam are kind of core team of amazing portrait photographers. And I know you guys each have a little bit of a different approach to the way that you work with your clients. So I'm wondering, from your perspective, Kat, how does color play a role, or does it play a role in your thought process on how you either work with your clients or do your personal work?
I would say it plays a really big part in even my client work, and is set with the intention. However, I am not as skilled as I would like to be in the execution. So it's interesting that, sometimes I sort of happen upon really terrific, fantastic execution. And then other times I'm like, and I get mad at it. So it does sort of present itself in post. But I think, Becca's comment about it being, in tandem with light is paramount. And it all falls back to the intention that's set, in that consultation about, what do we want to portray? And that will drive the light and the color. But more often than not, I definitely sort of accidentally execute well. And then other times I don't. But when I can design a session with that color space in mind beforehand, beyond just okay, this family's going to bring in, they're all wearing navy, right? But then, bringing in the emotional aspects is really where the final choices of color will be made at the end of the day.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm really glad that you also brought up post-processing. And I know, Bassam, you mentioned that as well with, with how you're kind of toning everything afterwards also. And I fall in a really similar boat where I have, so my narrative voice shows up a lot in my color preferences, which tend to all be within the kind of earth tone range. And then every now and then, if I'm shooting something that's like sci-fi, then it pushes out into, you know, fun, what like more fluorescent colors. But that tends to happen without me purposefully chasing it, because those are my preferences, my natural preferences. But then I also find myself using color really specifically more in small areas. So I would never do something like Kate does, where my entire purpose is to like make the image feel like the color red, right? But I would use red in a pop somewhere to draw the eye. And I don't make a lot of those decisions consciously, I think. I just tend to, it makes sense for the story, which is why I was so glad that Becca mentioned the narrative weight, because it's the narrative weight in both sides. So it's the narrative weight visually and how that is interpreted in almost a split second, right? Which we'll see when we start looking at some of these color palettes. But it's also the narrative weight of why somebody would be wearing this color if they're at this point in their life where we happen to see the image. So why would the Angel of Justice be wearing a red sash, right? Like that is a question that I'm asking myself when I'm choosing that color to put it in the image. So, you know, the narrative itself, the story, and then of course the visual narrative and how that's kind of interpreted within the frame is all something that I do think about, but I do not have the same facility with color that Kate does. And I'm like, I don't know that anybody does, you know, but I find it much easier to put together a color palette when I'm photographing than I do when I'm doing digital art. That is much more difficult for me because I have a harder time judging the weight of colors and when I want something to be deeply saturated versus when it needs to be kind of, you know, toned down, and like how those things weigh against each other. That's a skill that I'm definitely still building. So I think I struggle there a little bit.
One of the things that, you know, we've been working on in the studio is new marketing material. And one of my associates, she's very, very driven by color and very like saturated, vibrant, rah, rah, rah. And instilling in her the understanding of the visual literacy aspect, you know, looking at it from a marketing material standpoint, she wants to be able to showcase the range and the vibrancy of her work. However, she's still learning how to make it cohesive across the board. And even though she's trying to find, like she's creating a collage for like an accordion panel, right? And the majority of her work with the studio is in studio, but she wanted to include some yellows and some golds. But her only representation of yellows and golds are in outdoor work. And the two pieces that she chose for the marketing material in that, you know, warmer gold space were not visually cohesive with the rest of the work that was being showcased on the panel, either from demographic standpoint, or even just like the consistency of studio work. And so we've been sort of back and forth a lot, like, no, you can't include those because it's going to confuse your audience. So understanding the confusion aspect and how you're creating color. So maybe it's not with just an individual image with client work, it's who is the audience and how are you presenting, even in the color space, holds just as much weight, if not more weight, than understanding the color specifically. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think anybody who has tried to kind of have a cohesive brand presence will understand how that works as well. And even when you're putting together a portfolio, you know, your online portfolio, if the color is jarring and there are a lot of contrasts there, it makes it really hard to get a good visual flow. So a lot of people will be really cognizant of color when they're building that portfolio, so that the way that you transfer from image to image doesn't, you know, jar you out of being able to enjoy everything. So I think those relationships overall are so super important. So we are going to start sharing some images that we can look at and start to see how color really is going to impact us and what some of our kind of initial reactions to color are going to be. Try to break some of those things down. But before we do that, just want to ask our audience this morning, y'all, if you have any questions, please don't be afraid to put those in the comments and we will snag them up before we start getting into the visual aspects so we can see color at work in some of these different scenarios. But just want to make sure we also really quickly bring up the fact that color is not only evolutionarily powerful, right? So there are evolutionary levers that color pulls because of our relationship to our environment, but then there are also cultural levers that color pulls based on the culture that we live in and why certain colors are related to certain things, both from a religious standpoint, from a socioeconomic standpoint, from all of these things. So realizing kind of the depth and the power of color to affect us psychologically is really, really important. Even if you choose not to make it a huge focus of your work, you still need to understand that it's going to impact your viewer. They are going to interpret it. And if you wonder whether or not that's true, start taking a look at the color inside restaurants. When you go into restaurants, take a look at the kind of colors that are included in food advertising. They are using color very specifically to either make something more or less palatable. And that's a deep psychological trigger that we have. So, you know, the next time you go to eat something, ask yourself also, like, what are the colors of your favorite foods? You may find that you avoid certain colored foods for a specific reason. There's a reason that Green Eggs and Ham is a children's book, because that's not a natural color to have that kind of food. It doesn't make sense to us. That's a cue that something is wrong. So just think
Beige
about some
food
of those
bad.
things. Beige food is bad. Potatoes, that's all I'm going to say. Corn tortillas also. I don't believe flour tortillas should be had with tacos. I know everybody's going to hate me. I'm sorry, but corn tortillas are better.
Yeah, we're gonna fight.
Bring it. Okay, let's start looking at some of these things visually. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And the first thing we're just going to look at is a couple color palettes, just so that we can see what our initial reaction to these color palettes would be and what we would interpret or where we would see colors like this. So just a quick color palette, super, super simple. But initially, if you were to say on gut instinct, what is this color palette for? What does it relate to? What does it bring to your mind? You can blurt it out. If you're in the audience, type it in really quickly. What is this color palette?
Cigar lounge.
Cigar
Like
lounge.
old British mahogany cigar lounge.
Yeah, getting similar vibes. Wasn't thinking cigar lounge. I was thinking wine on a patio in Italy in a painting.
Yeah. Okay, wine lounge.
Can it be?
We can have both.
Both is always better. What about you, Matt? Does color palette give you any initial impression of anything?
Yeah, there's definitely a luxury royal feel for me, and I think my eyes keep going to that maroonish burgundy that I think pulls me in there. But that and the blue makes it feel very luxurious. So whether it's a bourbon bar or a castle in Italy, those are the two colors that kind of drive that emotion for me.
Yeah, I definitely. So this, for some reason, has a very kind of like a study, a library, that has that kind of feel for me. But also, it has a very fall feeling to me. Like these kind of rich, deeply saturated, earth tony, like it also feels like fall to me.
See, I'm just gonna make some people mad. It just reminds me of like late '90s artwork that you would find in TJ Maxx.
Cultural. Oops, this is still my brush from a painting that I'm working on. So if you're in the audience today, like, let us know when you see this color palette, what does it have you thinking of? Does it bring anything immediately to your mind? Or does it give you any kind of immediate influences? Let me change that up. There we go. That is much better than my gray big brush. So, okay, Justin saying he gets an industrial feel. That's really interesting. Anybody else?
I originally thought of that because I saw the striations in what looks like metal or something behind the palette, right? In
Oh,
those small
sure.
little spaces. So seeing that made me think exactly the industrial, but I was just like, no, I'm just getting drawn in. I'm not looking at the colors. So, but yeah, I feel
Right.
the same way.
I mean, I can definitely see that in some of those kind of rust and older tones in metal that you might see. I can see that showing up for sure. I agree with Kat, Midwest 90s. Anybody else? What does this just immediately hit you with? Don't try to read into it too far, but just a kind of immediate gut impulse. And then we'll move on to the next one real quickly. If nobody knows.
I think, Nicole, too, it might be, and I would not be able to give this lecture, but perhaps you could, or Becca. But the differences in saturation, in luminance, and hue, right? As we're looking at this, we play with it all the time as photographers and artists, but do we really understand what those three things drive in terms of how we feel in the color?
For sure. And while we're just gonna see, let's just try something really quickly. Do we still feel like this is a cigar bar? Does it still feel like wine in a castle in Italy? Does it still feel like a fancy library? If we blue tone all these colors, do we still get that?
I find it a cheaper version. They shopped at the wrong place.
I'm telling you.
I love that.
No, but it tells you it's how little nuances make a difference, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Let's try the opposite direction. Let's really kind of redden these up some. Now, of course, we're looking at this comparatively, right? A
Right.
big part of the relationship of color is in the image itself and how they work together. After you looked at this for a while, you would cease to be able to see as much of the red as you think you see now. So, I mean, that's something to keep in mind. But let's even go with saturation. If we look at the difference in the way this color palette behaves when the saturation is different. And then to Becca's point earlier, if we were to switch this sucker to black and white, and we look at the way that the different colors behave.
Completely different, yeah.
If you were just to change the reds, which is one of those really powerful colors that shows up in black and whites in a special way. Obviously, if we were to shoot this and process it for black and white and there was no red in the image, right? So your contrast would be completely different. So let's have a look at, not that one yet. Let's have a look at this one.
But on that subject, when I process color pictures and turn them into black and white, where I have to pay the most attention is exactly how I play with the oranges, obviously for the skin tones, right?
Right.
And just to be able to keep that person's true representation of their skin luminosity, let's put it that way, because you can make somebody look a completely different race just by tweaking that orange slider too much.
You can.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely something to keep in mind. So this color palette, what do we see here? Does this remind us of anything? What does it say? If you're in the comments today, if you're hanging out in the audience.
Jimmy Buffett Bar in Key West.
I was going to say Miami, but you're close enough, Matt.
It's got some South definitely
Beach.
some
South Beach.
water related stuff, huh?
Club Med. I think they have similar colors, at least the blues.
So maybe it's just because I'm a lot younger.
Oh, don't start
This is
that
also-
shit right now.
No, when I think 90s, everything was this color. All my little kindergarten clothes and toys and cups and
This has
Yeah.
hypercolor t-shirts written all over it, y'all.
yep.
I think it definitely, for me, still it has a kind of a nautical feel to it, as some kind of beachy something. Malibu Barbie, I think, was this color.
A lot of
Her skin was
multiple
like this
layered
color.
polo shirts.
Ah,
All the colors, all of them.
colors popped. And then obviously, so there's definitely a cultural aspect to this, right? Where we lived in history, at what times did we live, and were colors like this like highly available and obvious at that point? And I mean, that makes perfect sense for some of those things to be called up.
It's like old lady boutique in Florida.
I love it. Okay. What about this one?
Pinterest Easter.
Say that again.
Pinterest Easter.
Pinterest Easter. If you're in the audience today, we want to hear from you. Let us know. What do you see? What is this color palette?
I know
My-
this one's throwing me off a bit.
Terrible plaid.
Yeah.
Say that again, Kat.
Terrible plaid.
Yeah, I was gonna say it throws me off a bit. It's odd. I don't like it. And there's something about that center color, the beige, that just doesn't. It kind of turns me off. I can't explain why.
This reminds me of Coastal Grandma. You know, like her house is going to be in some of these colors, and she's going to wear some of this stuff in really blousy, soft colors when she goes out.
This is absolutely that like nautical beach themed bathroom that every
Yeah.
single grandma
Or
had.
the kitchen with like the mint.
Yes. Or
Yeah.
the kitchen. Yeah. Justin's saying a stormy autumn forest. So he's getting kind of some autumn vibes here.
It's the color palette of decorative soaps.
Oh, old school travel agency. Okay.
Totally got those vibes, Eliza. Yep.
Yep. I can see that. So let's drop this one. And we looked at this one too. We're going to check that out in a little bit, but let's just have a look at this one. It doesn't really matter here whether we like this one or don't like it, but what does it say? And we'll talk about likes in a second.
This was my hair sophomore year in high school. Also,
love
Disney
that.
villain. Disney
Disney
villain.
villain.
Definitely Disney villain.
So yeah, this one to me represent certain culture, Middle East culture colors. There's a lot of those colors that you would find in the Middle East, in Arab countries. I am from Lebanon. I visited a lot of old architectural sites inside and out, and those colors are used quite often. And in the Muslim world, that middle color, not exactly that middle color, that aqua, a little bit less saturated and more vibrant, less saturated, more luminosity, is heavily used in the Muslim world.
I'm curious, Bassam, if those greens would remain green or move into more of the gold family, but I think you just answered that.
The greens?
Yeah.
You mean in that setting, in that context?
Like in this palette specifically, like often when you see these like purples in that heavily saturated space, you would find the mids and the highs in more of like the gold family.
Yeah, well, gold, I think, I'm going to ask you a question. I think both. I think if you look at the top green, the more minty green, I think that one you will find more of. You won't find much of that, more saturated, darker green. And yes, you can replace that with gold, and that would be more representative. Because obviously there's also a lot of gold reference, and whether it's wealth and so on. So yes, that's a good
That royal space, yeah.
Yeah.
Ooh, so interesting. I love that we got the chance also to bring that kind of cultural and then also religious aspect into being able to see these colors. And this for me is an incredibly uncomfortable color palette. Like this is really uncomfortable to look at for me. And I think which also why people immediately said Disney villain. These are some particular colors that are really interesting to work with because green can be a very comforting, like life feeling image. It can also look really, really toxic. And purple is one of those interesting colors that is, when you push it towards blue, it has certain connotations. And when you pull it towards red, it has certain connotations. And it's interesting if this is one of those ones that if you are to change the saturation, all of a sudden the feeling is entirely different. Like it could almost not even be the same thing. It's wild how quickly something can go from being like overpowering and really loud to, okay, like that's a whole different feel. All right, so we've looked at a few color palettes and just tried to get a feel for what they immediately evoke in us. Now we're going to actually look at some scenes that is the exact same scene, and we're going to see how light and color are tied together, as Becca mentioned at the very beginning, and the way that affects how we feel about what is happening in the scene. Even if the scene itself changes not at all, how does light and color affect the mood? So let's see here. We're going to start up here and just look at a few examples and see the way that here we have our purples and blues in display, and here we have the color contrast of the warms and slightly cools and greens. Just if we look at the emotional impact that this has. Same guy on the horse, same landscape, different lighting scenarios, which of course then bring about different color. And how cleverly these can be used to affect the way that we feel. And if you ever want to look at this in real time, break down a movie by what is happening at that point in the movie, and you'll be able to see the times when they are using color and lighting really specifically to make you feel certain things. Cinematographers are genius at this.
Yeah, there's an article I read a while back about just the color toning in some of the big series that we liked, right? Like Breaking Bad had a certain color palette. Spaghetti Westerns have a certain color palette, right? So it always plays into that emotion very specifically. And this is a really neat exercise to be able to look at the same scene with different colors on it. So distinctly different between all of them. I really like this.
Yeah. I really wanted to make sure that we looked at this, and we can talk about this again when we talk about light. And this is actually, I've been building a tutorial for a while that's storytelling light that is really specifically to do this and find out how light tells a story in the scene, even if everything else stays the same. So these, I love these so much. So if we look at this and this color palette, which is very kind of natural, and the light feels really natural, and then we begin to switch, the psychology of light comes into play. We immediately can sense the difference, the danger. This kind of light and where it's coming from only comes from fire, right? Like this color and the way that it affects the landscape and the contrast that it adds, all of those things. Magic, right? So we have danger, wonder, or magic. All of these different lighting scenarios that really just give the exact same place an entirely different feel. And color 100% coming into play there. If I was to ask you what time of day this was, what would you say?
Early morning.
Yep. We have a really great instinct for this, which is why color and light are so important, and color we can tell. So if we were to change this, if we were to give this, if we were to go like this a little bit, right? Like all of a sudden we start to get into a more of an evening feel because the light waves change, the length of the light waves change during what time of day it is. And so like we have instincts for that based on our evolutionary response to our environment. So, and if we don't know this, right, then we can't control the message that we're sending to the viewer via color, especially if we're doing environmental things or if we're mimicking environmental light, even in a studio environment or in a painting. All right. So let's then move on and look at some of these things in different kinds of art and see if we can unpack how color has been used or what that color makes us feel. And we're going to start with Kandinsky, just because the color is used, obviously, huge part of decomposition itself. So some of these were choices that you brought in, Becca. So I would love to hear what your thoughts were when you picked a few of these. Like, what were you kind of hoping we would be able to see and maybe get out of seeing color used this way?
I mean, I'm like not really into Kandinsky, which is kind of why I sent you that. Because I don't know a ton about him and his art. I love abstract art in general, but it makes me so, like, it's so visceral, which is effective and good, and I can appreciate that, but it's almost too uncomfortable for my personal taste. But because of how complicated, how much is going on, I mean, like, it is this very, again, visceral kind of visual experience. Like, you're everywhere and feeling all these things all at once. So props to him there. Not my faves, but props to his artistry.
Yeah, I definitely have some thoughts, but I would love to hear. So friends who, if you're in the audience today and you're watching this, gut reaction, how does this image make you feel? Matt, Bassam, Kat, what about y'all? When you see this, what are your kind of gut reactions to it?
Chaos.
Yeah, I'm uneasy.
Yeah, I'm uncomfortable too. I would walk right past it.
I feel like I would look and then go, I can't. Like, I feel my anxiety already starting to rise. Justin saying it feels like I'm walking through a grower's market or a vibrant market. And then Crystal saying sensory overload. Yeah, that's how I feel as well. Just visually, it's so much noise.
I think, you know, there's unease because I have a very symmetrical linear type of brain, and this kind of thing always throws me for a loop. It's interesting. Like, I can sit and stare at this and try to understand it, and I think there's beautiful play of color and how some of the gradients are, and I think it's wonderful to look at, but it doesn't make me feel good or be like, ooh, I need that in my living room, right? But it's impressive. Maybe I'll use that word.
I find it deeply uncomfortable. So let's just do something really quickly. I'm going to just fill this with a 50% gray layer and set it to color. So this is a kind of a true representation for most things of the actual luminosity of the colors without making any difference. When we see it this way, are we still as uncomfortable?
No. Much more interesting for me. I can navigate across the tonal differences and not feel threatened.
I like that language a lot. So chaos, but my eye goes constantly to the object in the center of the image that is crossed out. And I think what's great when we turn on and off the color in this is we can see either way that this is still kind of the visual center of the image. And then we've got balance happening in other places, but even without that, this is kind of the visual center, right? So, woof, here we go. After seeing it in black and white, bringing back the color, do we still have the same feeling? Does it still feel overwhelming? It's interesting to me because after seeing it in black and white, I find it easier to take in color. I still don't like it, but
yeah, I don't love it, but I think it's really super interesting that the majority of those mids are super muddy.
So I think this is a really great example of the way that color can be used visually to create emotion, even if it's not a positive emotion, where there is no recognizable symbol to hang on to, right? Like if we were to walk in and all of these colors were in a restaurant, we still might not want to be in that restaurant, but it would at least make sense to us. When they're combined this way, your brain doesn't know how to process this. And there's a lot of unnatural colors in here as well, which I think can make it even more uncomfortable. So I'm just grabbing. The black and white definitely made objects stand out more clearly. Now with the color, I'm still catching that festival vibe. In black and white, I noticed the creature crouched in the lower left corner, and I see it easier in color after the black and white. Super, super interesting. Let's look at another piece. So here's a still from, let me zoom out a little bit. The Prince of Egypt. Remember before we were looking at some of those purples. And we have a lot of visual clues here in addition to color, right? So this color palette, I mean, this is just such a cleverly done piece anyway, but how does it make us feel?
War.
Anybody else?
I will reserve gushing about how brilliant this movie is until you're ready.
You can gush away to me. I am all about this stuff. So anybody have any kind of initial feelings that it makes them want to share?
Well, outside of the subject matter itself, right? Shit falling from the sky. I think, yeah, there's the darker blues and purples have that sense of foreboding or ending for me, right? So that's kind of what I feel like, this is the last scene in whatever I'm seeing. And that bright orange and reds give me all that danger and fury like we were talking about earlier. So it's this really just kind of like sad, depressing emotion that I'm connected with this, regardless of the expression on the guy's face. I'm trying to look at it without it. And yeah, I get the same feelings, right? So yeah, definitely the end of something. Just because of those tones, the nighttime images of those tones.
Yeah. So there's something I 100% want to share in just a second. So somebody's saying, Disney, this is actually DreamWorks. I'm so sorry. This is DreamWorks. One of DreamWorks' best, I think. But yes, so we recognize this one, right? Like so many of us have got to see this show. Justin saying immediately religious. The purples evoke royalty, but the red orange evoke war and strife. That's a really, really great, like read into that. And just one of those interesting things, supernatural elements are very often coded purple in cinema. So you will pick up on these very naturally without having to be told. If you watch enough movies, cinema codes supernatural things very often in purple. And so we have dangerous things coming down from the supernatural thing. There's a lot of elements of composition here that, I mean, there's so much that we could go into just in this one image that is done so well. But those purples, and you can see that the whole image is toned with them. So it's not just the sky. The shadows here are purple. The color of his skin is that orange and purple mix. Even the orange is toned with purple. So there's like, this is very heavily and made very clear through color. This is not a natural event that's happening, right? If it was, these would be the kinds of colors that you would see from a stormy sky. I know we have to move quickly. I wish we could stay on them longer, but color is so big and we got a lot to cover. So here's another image that is very familiar to most of us. And I would love, first of all, I've always loved the simplicity and asymmetric compositions of Japanese and Chinese painting of all kinds, whether it's, Sumi-e or anything else. Aside from that, How do we read this?
This gives me the feel of a raw photograph before you actually processed it. It's blah in terms of colors from a color perspective. I find it's unfinished yet, right? From a, just first look. It's like, can you saturate a little bit? Can you put some pop in it? Can you, yeah, maybe the white's a little more white. I don't know. That's how I feel.
Sure.
Yeah.
Friends in the audience today, what are you thinking? How does color impact the way that you see this image?
I was looking for Cookie Monster. Have you seen the version with the Cookie Monster in this one?
No, but now I have to see it.
Yeah.
Oops. Sorry.
Yeah, because of the low saturation and the kind of like all the muted tones that Bassam was just talking about, I see a certain tranquility in the chaos, right? Not trying to get into analyzing the image too much, but I think just the desaturation of it, the muted palette makes it feel less foreboding to me, even though these guys are about to get hammered by a wave. It makes me feel apprehensive as I would otherwise. Than I think like when we were looking at the purples and greens, when they were super vibrant and they were just kind of like, oh God, there's danger in there. I don't feel that with this image. And I think it's because of those taupes and just the tones of blue and the nice gradients. I don't know. That's the way I see it. It calms me down.
Just for people who are interested, I just want to give a little bit of history here. So this is obviously this is the Great Wave by Hokusai, and it was a woodblock print. So many of these were made, and the color is not exactly the same in every one because of the nature of woodblock printing. So what we're seeing is just kind of an overall representation and not an exact like this particular color is how the artist meant it to be kind of thing. So just for to keep that in mind.
So what I find interesting in general, a lot about a lot of Eastern art versus like Western European art, is the difference in perspective and what that does for the color. So like in the Italian Renaissance, right, that was kind of like when artists started utilizing this idea of atmospheric perspective and describing like great depth in a landscape through color and light. And in a piece like this, we don't have that. The color is consistent and untouched by the sense of atmosphere. And I think it actually, I mean, even though, yes, it's muted, it doesn't have bright whites or bright colors, like it still has this consistency and harmony in the color that you wouldn't get if you were going for that like really realistic feel that you get in Western art. And I find that just beautiful and also maybe more impactful in a lot of ways because it allows you to use the color, I think, more kind of abstractly as opposed to realistically. And so those blues are powerful from all the way up close to us, all the way back to the mountain in the background.
Yeah, and I think what I like about this particular image, so you see color used in a much more this is true to nature way, right? In a lot of Eastern art, you'll see it very like they're not necessarily going to go change the color of the water for emotional impact. Blue is the color of the water. But you see the dynamism, the movement, the composition, the shape language, those things have in a big way. That's what give us that sense of foreboding and not the color itself. But also a lot of this type of art is the kind of thing that was meant to be bought by tourists. It was meant to be sent overseas. And so you want something you can still hang up in your home that's not going to make your home feel uncomfortable. And if you were to take a piece like this and color code it in a way that was meant to make you feel maybe the terror of these fishermen in their boats, it would be an uncomfortable piece to hang in your house. It would be an uncomfortable piece to buy. And a lot of fine artists will tell you their best-selling work, even the ones that are the most striking, like a crazy orange and magenta sunset, don't sell as well because they're uncomfortable for people to have in their homes. They tend to buy colors in images that are easier to have on the wall. And so I think even thinking about it from that perspective is really interesting when you're looking at the history of a piece of art like this. Okay. let me see here. I think this is the last one we have to look at. And this one is obviously interesting because of the nature of the subject matter and how that plays into how these images were painted. But another question for everybody quickly as we're coming to the end of the hour, kind of gut reactions and how you feel like the color is making you feel. How does color play into this image? Whoops. Any thoughts? Don't be afraid to share them. If you're in the audience today, we want to hear those in the comments.
I'm right back to where we started at the very, very beginning, that first color palette that we looked at. I know there's more greens in this than there were in the original, but this gives me that same sort of luxurious feel, right? Whether it's the bourbon bar or maybe heaven. I think it just gives me that same sense of luxury and richness and lushness, just because of the greens and the blues and the golds. It's very pleasing. It's very soft, which kind of plays into the whole subject matter. But yeah, luxurious is what I would describe it as.
So the color palette is regal, Crystal saying, and Justin saying Renaissance Catholic.
So even though this is super muted, whether that's age or intent or whatever, what I love about this painting and the color is how well it draws your eye right to Mary in the center. I mean, it creates this really beautiful color contrast between the red and the blue symbolism and usage aside, but just aesthetically, boom, that's where your eye goes. They just everything from the contrast between blue and red to the use of the value, you know, the darkness of the greens, pushing your eye in from those side corners right down to her. It's just absolutely masterful without needing to be super saturated.
Yeah. And also, like, this is one of those things where it's important for us to note the religious significance of these kinds of colors as well, because gold, obviously, the color of kind of divinity and royalty. We have blue, which is often purity and innocence. This Mary is almost always seen with some kind of blue on her. And of course, here she has gold as well. And so, like, recognizing then the cultural significance and the religious significance of these colors, really important when we're parsing pieces of work like this one. So I know we are like right at the end of our hour. So if anybody has any other final thoughts, let's get to them really quickly, and then I'll start closing things down.
You left out my other example, Nicole. It's the best one.
I'm sorry. We don't have time.
I cry.
Oh, she felt really bad about that.
Yep, my
She
bad.
left.
This is me judging you and kicking you.
Sorry, I had to say goodbye to my husband, unless you guys want to watch me like giving kisses and smooches on screen, and you're just gonna have to settle for me disappearing for a second.
How are you gonna light it, and what colors are you gonna use?
It's all gonna be flat. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and drop this off, and then we will kind of give our final thoughts and shut down for the day. Oops, I don't have to do that way. I can just stop screen sharing. All right, so we have seen color palette in various different scenarios. We have looked at just color palettes and had a feeling about like how those color palettes made us feel. We have seen similar, or like the same, I should say, scene using different colors and how that affects how we feel about things. So having seen those examples, I wonder, does that make anybody who has not made color much of a focus on in their work, does that make you want to use it a little bit more, or like consider maybe being more purposeful in your use of color?
I don't think it's going to change anything that I do, but it definitely gives me insight to when I do decide for personal work. Let's say if I start playing with color, it just gives me a lot to think about. But day-to-day work, probably not going to change a ton. But I liked some of those exercises of seeing the same thing in different color patterns, or even just the palettes in different color tones. Really kind of struck home to me how much I can pay attention to it when I'm looking at everything else.
For sure. Crystal saying, yep. So that's one convert, Becca. A question really quickly, if we've talked about Adobe Color Analyzer and using it to exact themes and palettes. We have not. It's definitely something we can put some links up to in the Facebook group. We tend to focus more on the why as opposed to the how in this group. We don't always get into a lot of like actual specific technique. We more are looking at the kind of psychology and the reason behind things, but that's a fantastic piece of information for folks to use, and we can kind of share that. And if you have any resources that you would want to share for people being able to do that, feel free to share them in the Facebook group, because folks can definitely use that to great effect.
I mean, I think that's maybe worth exploring, if not on one of the streams, but looking at the specific usage of color and pulling those colors out specifically to create palettes from specific scenes. So the one image I was really hoping you would share was a still from Gangs of New York. So, but actually having multiple ones at once might work better. So maybe I'll drop them on Facebook. But what I love about the color grading in this film is, I mean, of course, it's it's masterful in general, but it uses red, white, and blue throughout the entire movie, and it's just I can't. But it's just like once you know to look for it, it's so incredibly just I cannot. But that's the kind of thing that if we were to go use the color analyzer or even just color picker or whatever in Photoshop, we can pull out those colors and start looking at them both in how that they work or they in relationship to one another, but also how they exist on their own. So that could be kind of cool.
Could be. Justin asking, what is true color? And I think that's a really interesting question, because it depends on what you're actually talking about. Light and then pigment.
And everyone's eye is going to interpret that light differently too. I mean, this is something that has been measured by scientists, that people don't actually see the colors the same. So how do you know what is the true color?
Yeah. Your rods and cones, man. So we can obviously use technology to do things like measure the wavelength of things. And so pigment comes into play, of course, when light hits something and refracts off of pigment. What does that light, what is being reflected, what is being refracted, and what wavelengths you're getting, and then how your eye interprets those. So it's a difficult question to answer, and you'd probably have to be really specific about what you mean to get any particular answer that's useful, I think, out of that question. So as we come to the end here, any final thoughts, y'all? And then I'll just close everything down. Nope.
I would recommend also, everyone watch Gangs of New York. Everyone watch The Prince of Egypt. That is the absolute top 5 animated films of all time. Like absolute spectacular use of color, even just looking at the stills. But if you don't want to go do that, I highly, highly recommend everyone also go just Google color scripts, and which is going to be that breakdown that Nicole mentioned about how it's almost like a storyboard of an entire movie, and it moves through the color and it follows the narrative feel of color throughout a film. And just doing that to get a feel for stories that you already are familiar with or that you love, and understand how that color looks as a moving object, can really help elevate your understanding of color as well.
Yeah, if you want to study color, study cinema for sure. And you'll see things like not only do individual characters are often coded with a color. So the movie I Am Sam, Sam is coded blue, and Michelle Pfeiffer's character, I don't remember the name of the lawyer, but she is coded red. And as the movie moves, she begins to lose her red and become much more blue as she becomes influenced by who he is as a person and is forced to look at her life in a different way. So you'll see that characters are often coded with certain colors, not only in the lighting and the environment, but also in their clothing. And then the tone of the movie, as Becca mentioned, changes depending on, are things dangerous? Are things happy? Are we at the good part of the movie or the bad part of the movie? And you'll be able to see all of that. It's an absolutely brilliant way to learn about color. So color, amazingly powerful thing.
even that example, I know I can go on and on, from the Prince of Egypt earlier, and when the scene is very purple and it's being overcome by that red. So throughout the movie, Moses is coated red. His sister Miriam is coated red. The Jews in general are coated red. So you have this red overcoming the blue of Egypt and all the more Egyptian pharaoh characters. And there's a lot of blue used on that Egyptian side. So you have that color contrast used subtly for character, and you see it then narratively when the red starts to overcome those blues too later in the film. So much.
It's good stuff. All right, y'all. So obviously we have been focusing on visual literacy. Now we are into the nuts and bolts of what is included in an image, what an artist chooses to include in the frame, and color being one of those highly powerful and deeply important ways that we can choose to help people understand what the intent of an image is. Go back and look through your own work and start asking yourself how you've been using color, and see if you can find your visual preferences or how color is being used, even if you're doing that unconsciously, and then question, how can you change that if you choose to in your work? What could you include? How could you use the psychology of color to influence your viewer to feel certain things or to catch the meaning of your work even more powerfully? And we will be together again on Friday at 7 a.m. Mountain Standard Time doing more visual literacy cool stuff. And I hope that you will come and join us for that. Come and be part. We love having you guys here and having the conversation in the comments, and hearing your thoughts and what you think and getting your questions. Yes, thanks, Justin, for being here this morning. Crystal, and I know Dustin was here with us. So love having you guys be here this Friday. You can always go check out theartistforge.com, where there are podcasts and blog posts. And then, of course, we are always together the 2nd and 4th Thursdays of the month doing more exercises like this one. We hope you guys have an amazing week. Go make something fantastic, and we'll see you again on Friday morning. Bye, y'all.
Bye, guys.